Hi, and welcome to another episode of Kink Candid. We have a special guest host tonight who I am going to allow to introduce himself here in just a moment. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that apply to both sides of the equation that sometimes we don't always remember how they apply to both sides. And we'll go from there. I will let you intro yourself now.
Good evening. My name is Jay. I'm a full-time lifestyle master with a live-in slave.
All right. So I do want to clarify before I go any further that I am going to use the terms dom and sub. However,
it doesn't matter to me.
It doesn't necessarily mean just dom and sub. Like we talked in our first episode about the difference between tops and bottoms and daddies and littles and masters and slaves. The terms apply to everybody on either side of the slash, as we say. So I know we talk a lot in the community these days about boundaries and sort of limits and how those things apply to what I have referred to as us S-types, and that we can and should expect our dom partners to respect those limits and boundaries and not push us beyond what we are willing to be pushed. But I'm noticing a bit of a trend of late to not really realize how that applies to the dominants too. I see it a lot in terms of the brat kind of dynamic, particularly with, well, he should accept that you're a brat, you shouldn't have to change, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not necessarily fair. And I brought Jay on the show with us because I wanted to get a dom's perspective on this, a master's perspective on how these boundaries, these limits work from that side of the slash too. And in particular, how you, in particular, as our example dominant type, would want those to be expressed and respected by the S-types in your life. I also want to talk a little bit about aftercare and some other things too, but let's start with this.
Now, start wherever you want, but put as simply as I can, if the relationship doesn't move two ways, if the respect doesn't move two ways, then the relationship isn't going to last. It's not going to work. Both parties, let me clarify. Let me correct myself there. All parties in a relationship, because I know that there are relationships that feature more than two partners, and I've been in those and am in one currently. So, yeah, all parties in a relationship have their limits. They have things that do work and things that don't work. It isn't limited to simply the submissive partners in a relationship. I have things that my partners are into that I know they're into, that we've discussed and we've tried, and things that do work and things that don't work. And the things that don't work, things that don't make me, that aren't comfortable for me or aren't safe for one reason or another in my life, we simply avoid, or they find other outlets for those particular needs. And I'm willing to allow them to do that. But it starts with everybody has limits, and you're either going to respect them and you're going to find a way to work within those limits, within those boundaries, or you find new partners. Because if you can't do one or the other, then nobody's going to be happy.
I know I'm seeing a lot of talk on, particularly, like I said, with the brat thing. And I know we recommend, and it was recommended to me early on in my journey down this path, which, by the way, listeners, he's known me for literally all of my journey down this path. So is uniquely qualified to have this conversation with me. There's no one in this world that knows my journey in this lifestyle better than he does. He's known me for literally all of it. But I know it was recommended to me early on that there be straight up conversations, that it's not fair for us as submissives, as slaves, to kind of keep those things to ourselves, that we need to be very, very open about it. And that if once we are open, that needs to be respected and understood by our dominant partners, that we come into this from the beginning saying, these are things that I know work for me. These are things that I know don't work for me. And these are things that I'm not sure about yet. Because that's okay too, to not know, especially because I want to point out, because I know we have some newbies out there who are kind of going, but I don't know what works for me yet. And that's okay.
And that little list, by the way, and this is something I've discovered a lot more recently than I knew when we first met, or even further on in that relationship. That little list, the things that you're not sure about, that's going to grow. Because you're always going to discover things that the longer you spend in the lifestyle, the more things you're going to discover that sort of tweak your buttons a little bit and make you curious. And those things that make you curious are going to make you want to explore.
And you're going to find that changes. And I know it's true for submissives, and I'm going to assume that it's probably true for you guys on the other side of this as well. The other two lists will shift and change over time too. There are certain hard limits that I started with that are absolutely still hard limits for, and they're the pretty standard stuff, and anything that's illegal and things of that nature. There are some things that I knew from the get-go, not into that, and I'm still not. But there are some things that maybe I was okay with or might be okay with, and then discovered after trying them that no, just kidding, that didn't work for me at all. And it goes the other way too. There are things that I was like, you know what, I don't think I'm going to like that. And then we try it and it's like, oh wait, no, actually that's fun. So that's going to change.
It's going to change, and it does expand on, as you put it, on both sides of the slash. It's just as true for the dominant partner in a relationship as it is for the submissive partners. You find things that you're interested in that you never thought that you'd be interested in exploring. But there are also things that as you get older and as you spend more time in the lifestyle and as your needs, and not to put too fine a point on it, but as your body changes, you're going to find don't work anymore. Not as young as you used to be, so maybe rigging doesn't play as big a part in playtime as it used to.
Impact play, I think, especially from the submissive side too, I know is another one that does that a lot, where it's like, maybe the harder stuff, you get a little older, there's some arthritis in play, and, maybe you're like, you know what, that's not nearly as fun for me as it used to be. There was a time when that was really fun, and now I'm like, no, thank you. Don't want to do that. And so, I think it's really, really important to kind of discuss the fact that every couple, or triad, quadruple, whatever formulation your relationship takes, but every set of partners should be having these conversations, not only at the beginning, but throughout the relationship and from both sides. What works for you now? As a sub, as a dom too, what works for you now? What doesn't work for you anymore that used to? What used to work but now, used to not work and now does? Those sorts of things, and it's really, really important, especially for us submissives, to remember that those things go both ways, and it's not just physical; it's the dynamic kind of things too. If you are a higher protocol kind of submissive, you need to be very, very clear, because the DOMs have a preference and limits and boundaries as far as what protocols work for them and what doesn't. He's not a bad DOM because he's higher or lower protocol or used to being higher or lower protocol than you are. But it is something you need to discuss, because it's not a bad thing to have those boundaries, to say this is the kind of relationship that I want. And I think that's something that's kind of gotten lost along the way sometimes, where people think, okay, well, this is what I want, and that's great, but your partner has wants too.
Yeah.
And maybe they want to micromanage everything you do, and maybe they don't. Mine does not want to micromanage. Like, he wants no part of that, like, at all. If I came and told him I needed him to remind me to eat and shower, no, this is not a thing.
You would be out the door.
He doesn't want to do that. Yeah, he's not interested in that even a little. If I suddenly announced tomorrow that I wanted to do the brat kind of dynamic and play in that way, that's going to be a problem in my house too, because he doesn't do brats. And that's okay. It means he's not a good partner for, yeah. It means you're not a good partner for some people, but it's not inherently wrong or bad. It's just as valid for you guys to have these kind of boundaries as it is for us. And we need to show just as much respect for those boundaries and say, okay, you know what, I saw conversations online recently about that with someone who was kind of prone to that brat dynamic and had a partner that's not into it. And a lot of the conversation, they were asking for advice, and a lot of the responses seem to be coming from the perspective of, well, he needs to respect that that's who you are. You shouldn't have to change who you are for your relationship. No, you shouldn't. Problem is, he shouldn't either.
No, he should not.
And it's okay for him to not want a brat. Maybe that means you find a middle ground. Maybe it means you're not compatible. Maybe it means if you're poly, maybe it means you brat with somebody else. There's lots of ways to work around it, but just saying this is who I am, accept it is not really, it bothers me. If we said that to a submissive about their dom, that's who he is, he shouldn't have to change, you just need to accept that that's what he wants. Well, okay, that's not cool.
No, it's a perfectly valid approach. I can accept it, but I can also accept that you have a free ticket right out my front door.
Okay, that's fair. I can accept that that's who you are and you don't have to change it, but it doesn't mean you get to be here because that's going to be problematic.
There are plenty of other people that you can play with, just not me.
And so, and that's something I think that a lot of times people kind of forget about a little bit. They don't think about that. We talk a lot about submissive limits and submissive boundaries and that respect and consent and consent is very, very, very important. And it is. Consent is incredibly important. Consent is everything in what we do. Everything that we do is centered around consent.
Yeah.
But that has to go both ways. And if you're bratting or pushing these limits and boundaries with someone who didn't consent to them, you are violating their consent no matter which side of the slash you happen to be on. And that's something I think that especially the focus of the show has always been kind of on particularly two things: giving people a voice who live the way that we do, and also pointing out to some of the younger, newer ones, and I know I sound old, but that's okay, that this is a valid way to do things and giving advice to these sort of younger ones. And that's something I want to kind of say to, especially to all the younger submissives out there that are listening. Respect their limits too. They're just as valid as yours. And don't ever forget that in this lifestyle. On that note, we talk an awful lot about subspace. And subspace, by the way, is freaking awesome. It's amazing, and I love it. But I was recently reminded by a friend that dom space or top space is in fact a thing too. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about that because after all these years, I forget sometimes that that's a thing that exists.
Yeah.
And so I kind of want to get your thoughts on that. What does that feel like from that end of things? Because I know a lot about subspace, not so much with dom space.
Well, I'm gonna correct myself here, and in an attempt to be completely open with you and answer your question, I introduced myself as a full-time master, and that is how I spend most of my time. That is how I spend most of my life. However, in an attempt to, as I said, be completely honest and open with you and your audience, there are times, especially after I've spent, a significant amount of my time in what you call dom space, which, just as you said about subspaces, is freaking awesome. I love it. I love being there. I love seeing the devotion from the woman in my life when it clicks, when it works, which is still most of the time. It's never going to work all the time, but it is still most of the time. But there's also the fact that once I've been there for a significant amount of time, there is that need to, as I put it, recharge my batteries. And you and I have talked a lot about there not being, for you and for me either, a time out of role. But there are times when I will step down. There are times when I will seek the company of a female who is more dominant than I am, so that I can step down for a little while. Because as much as I love being dominant, as much as that is a part of who I am, and it's not a part that I'd give up for the world, there are times when I just can't.
And that's such an important point, because I actually had a conversation about that just the other day with somebody online about that there is no out of role time for me, and they kind of talked about the idea that, well, what about this, or what about that, or what about conversations, what about when you're tired? I'm like, there are times that are lower protocol. We do have to kind of step back a little bit, I think. And so I think it's interesting to hear that you guys experience that a little bit too, which is good to know, I think, because I know I do, where it's like, no, I can't right now. I need a break.
No.
I need a minute.
And you're going to find times like that. You're going to find times when you're sick, or you're tired, or you're sore, or something isn't feeling right. When, at least for me, when I can't do the things that I used to do. I talked earlier about maybe rigging isn't as big a part of our play as it used to be. Well, maybe scening isn't as big a part of our play as it used to be either. I'm not a child. I'm not in my 20s.
Right.
It becomes less about play and more about the life, and more about our time together, and more about our relationship. And that's fine. I enjoy that. I've come to grow into that a lot more than I ever thought I would. But then I started this in my 20s. I am so far on the wrong side of that anymore.
Oh, yes. It's been a long time, a long road, let's put it that way.
Yes, it has indeed. As my daughter would say, I won't lie.
Yep, not even gonna lie. And I find that that's something that's really really interesting to hear too, because we've talked a lot about that. I see a lot of conversations and things online where people talk about well, how often do you have scenes and this, that, and the other, and I'm going, and I invariably find that these conversations are usually started by people who are still in their 20s and kind of starting this, and I'm thinking to myself, after all these years, not very often. We don't do as much of that anymore, just because we're older, we're busy. Singing is not a huge thing anymore. It's not an elaborate kind of process anymore. Now it's more about enjoying each other's company and the things that we do for each other outside the bedroom. And so, and sub drop is a very real thing. That, when we do get that subspace, which you can get without extreme play, which is something I did not know when I first started. It doesn't have to be hard. It doesn't have to be extreme. It doesn't have to be the big scene. Sometimes just even the simplest things with your partner can lead to that euphoric, that subspace, that flying high kind of feeling that we get. And crashing out of that can sometimes be really hard. Sub drop is real, y'all, and it sucks. I am told that the DOMs experience something very similar.
You're not wrong.
Top drop, I've heard it referred to.
You have been told correctly.
I know that subspace tends to result in it's a crash. It really is. It's like you hit the wall sometimes and you're just like, bleh. Everything is kind of bleh at that moment. And I do want to let some people know that the thing that I learned over the years that I didn't know when I started was that subdrop is real, but not only more than that subdrop is natural and it's going to happen. And just because it happens doesn't mean that anybody did something wrong.
No. It doesn't mean that you're not being taken care of. It doesn't mean you're not a full-time sub. It doesn't mean that you're not a proper sub. It happens. You get tired. You get sick. You get sore. You need to rest. You need to recharge your batteries.
And sometimes I know that when he experiences here something in that sort of vein, that sort of top drop kind of thing, it may mean that, which leads me to the other topic that I wanted to talk about tonight, which is aftercare. Aftercare is so big, and I want to say that because I think some of the things I have to say on the topic of aftercare might imply that I don't think that. I do, in fact, realize that aftercare is hugely important. So I want to get that right out of the way. But the first thing I want to talk about is what aftercare might look like for DOMs, because I think we forget that they need aftercare too. And I know that for my other half, it's a lot of just exactly that, for time to recharge his batteries. It's let's lay here and watch TV, let's play video games, let's just cuddle. He needs that downtime.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm assuming it is probably something similar for you, I would imagine, something in that vein. That sort of recharge. Let me just woosah for a minute, as we say at my house.
I'm not familiar with that. You're going to have to explain that one.
It's a running sort of almost meme level joke that comes from the fact that when you do like yoga and things of that nature, you'll do that inhale, exhale. It goes woo-sah. And it's that sort of deep breath relaxing sort of thing. And so it's sort of become code for take a minute. So gotcha. We refer to it here as woosah. I just need to woosah for a minute. Just
gotcha.
Woosah and relax. And so that's the way we refer to it, is just woosah. And sometimes I need to woosah, and sometimes he needs a little woosah too. So
not wrong.
That's I think a lot of subs sometimes forget that. We think about a lot of it about aftercare, especially, as being something two things. One, we think aftercare is going to prevent subdrop. It doesn't.
It does not.
Not really. It doesn't work that way. And I don't think it would prevent top drop either.
No.
It doesn't do that.
That
drop still happens.
But no, it doesn't prevent it.
And that it's necessary for submissives, which, as I say, again, it is, but not only for us.
No.
It's important for our partners, too, that they need aftercare. They need to be loved on. They need to be told. Now, and I did want to ask you this, because I saw somebody say this earlier, and I'm very, very curious. I want a dominant perspective on this. I'm told that in some cases, top drop or dom drop can result in feelings of almost guilt over the fact that some of what we do is not particularly socially acceptable. And one of the things that we can do is to kind of reassure you guys that it's okay.
You're not wrong. There have been times when I've needed that reassurance.
Because, we generally love what you guys do, but sometimes I think we forget that we need to tell you guys that, yeah, I know the world outside thinks that what you're doing is terrible and evil, but I promise it's really not.
Yeah, no. And it's good to have that reassurance. It's good to hear that now and then.
Because, it's work, I know, what you guys do. And just as much as it is for us. And I don't mean to say that in a bad way. I mean, we say that it's work, but
it's not. And I heard this in a play I listened to not long ago. I do a lot of audio, but I heard this in a play that I listened to not long ago. Some of the most important work you will ever do is work you'll never be paid for.
That is a really good one. Yeah.
It
and I
is
hate to say work.
for both sides. It does take effort. But
It does, and I think that's
do it.
And I think that's the part I hate to use the term work because it sounds almost negative, like something you're required to do that you don't want to do. And
No.
and I don't think of it that way. I don't think of it that way. I think of it from my side of things as being sort of a, yes, it takes work and it takes effort just like any other interest that I have, any other passion that I have. It takes work to sew or craft or write or paint. Those things take work too, but we do them because we love them. And this is, for me, much the same sort of level of work. It takes work and effort, but I do it because I love it and it matters to me. And so I think we as submissives need to be very, very careful to remember that, our doms, they need aftercare too. We put ourselves into a fragile, vulnerable state, and we are at risk of feeling those sorts of drop feelings because we're in a vulnerable state. But I think you guys are probably more prone to feelings of that sort of, I heard somebody refer to it as almost imposter syndrome. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of imposter syndrome, but I think it's really interesting as it applies to dominance. We subs get it too. Imposter syndrome being that concept of, I'm not really this thing, I'm only faking it, and everyone's going to figure out that I'm only faking it. And it's a weird sort of anxiety thing that happens, and I know as submissives we do get that. I'm actually really crappy at this, and everyone's eventually going to figure out that I'm not very good at it. I'm just fooling everybody. And that's not true, but it feels that way sometimes, and I can see where that would apply to you guys as well, that sort of, I'm only doing these things and pretending that I'm a dominant. And so aftercare matters from that sense. It does help if, you as a sub are feeling sort of, the imposter syndrome, having them tell you what a good girl you are. And we've spoken in previous episodes of the fact that we do use the male and female pronouns in terms of dom and sub here, but that's only because most of the hosts that have been on the show, myself and any of the guests that I've had on the show, are all in male dom, female sub relationships. We recognize there are other formats, but that's the way it works at our house, so those are the natural pronouns for us. Please do not take offense. We're not suggesting that it's the only way that it can be. It's just the way that we're used to thinking of it. And hearing, you're such a good girl, or, I like the way you did that, or whatever, helps kind of feed that squash that imposter syndrome and feed that sense of self-worth. And I've recently tried to make an effort to remind myself to tell him that too. Thank you for doing that thing for me. That feels really good. I really enjoy this, that sort of thing, because it does seem to help, at least for him, to hear, you're doing a good job. You're being a good master, and I appreciate it.
Always important to know that you're doing it right and to know that the things you are doing are appreciated. And
I think doms need that just as much as we do. And so that's one form that aftercare can take. Now, aftercare, I brought him on the show partially, guys, because I need someone to help balance my feelings on this matter, because I am really bothered by the concept of how aftercare is now currently talked about. Aftercare is hugely important, but big caveat. What that looks like is not anything in particular.
No.
It's not a checklist. It's not if you are doing proper aftercare, you must do X, Y, and Z, otherwise it doesn't count. It's not how it works. I have seen people talk about what they need for aftercare, and what they need is way more elaborate than what I need.
Yeah.
And that's okay. It really is. Everyone has their own needs as far as aftercare is concerned, and I do think the level of aftercare you need, at least as a sub, and maybe for you guys as well, the level of aftercare that's needed does to some degree depend on the what's the word I want? Extremeness of the play that you're doing. Harder play needs more significant aftercare, I think, for a lot of people. The level of aftercare you need after heavy impact play is much different than you would need after a simple spanking and sort of that sort of thing for a lot of people, not everyone. But and so that's one thing. And I've seen lists of things that revolve around aftercare, and it's you need this, and this, and it's always a list, and it's run me a bubble bath and get me my teddy bear and make me a meal, and those things are all fine and dandy, provided they have been discussed. The reason I bring that up is because I've seen a trend of I need XYZ in the way of aftercare, which is fine. My Dom doesn't think aftercare needs to be all these things. His version of aftercare is A and B, and that's it. And the responses are almost always not, you guys need to have a conversation, which is my answer to most problems within the lifestyle, by the way. Communicate with your partners, have a discussion about it. But the responses are usually not, you guys should have a conversation and figure out what aftercare means within your relationship. It's almost invariably, he's not doing the right things. He's being a bad Dom. He's not taking care of you. Just because his version of aftercare doesn't match what you have in the vision you have in your own head, doesn't mean he's doing it wrong.
Can I say something here?
Go for it.
That may clarify, that may at least go a long way to clarifying what we're trying to get at. Nobody outside your relationship with your sub or your dominant has any right or any idea of what kind of aftercare is appropriate for either of you. Nobody outside of your relationship can tell you what the right amount of aftercare is.
That is a fantastic point, because thank you. That's much more clear than much more clear version of what I was trying to get across, is that aftercare doesn't take only one form. And if you go into it with a list in your head, a vision in your head of, as a Dom or as a sub, this is what aftercare looks like. Aftercare is this thing and this thing and this thing, and that's the only way that aftercare works. You're going to run into issues.
Yeah.
And aftercare is something, and I see people tell newer submissives particularly, aftercare is totally important. Aftercare, he needs to be doing this, this, and this. Well, no, not necessarily. First of all, you have to figure out what aftercare looks like for you. For me, aftercare is really a relatively minor thing. We don't play hard these days, for the most part, due to age and various other factors. But when we do, aftercare tends to consist of, let's lay here next to each other and cuddle up for a few minutes and, just relax and woosah, as it were. And we're going to woosah together. I tell him he's wonderful and I love him, and he tells me that he loves me and I'm a good girl. And that's what aftercare looks like for us. But I've been told point blank that we're doing it wrong. And that's the point I wanted to make, is that, aftercare isn't the same for everybody.
No.
I don't know what aftercare looks like in any one of my listeners' houses, but I can guarantee you that as long as it's something that you and your partner or partners have discussed, you're still doing it right. And so don't get caught up in the idea that you're doing aftercare wrong, and don't get caught up in the idea that because your sub or your Dom's version or vision of what aftercare looks like is different than the one that you came into this relationship with, don't get caught up in thinking that means that one of you is wrong.
Yeah, no.
Neither of you are wrong.
Also, it's not
the only form of that. No, it doesn't have to be, and it's not. I know for me, aftercare, and I'm gonna defer to you. I'm gonna ask you the same question that I asked myself in preparation for this. Aftercare doesn't always look the same every single time at my house,
no.
and I know you both pretty well, so I know you and your partners pretty well, so I'm going to assume that it doesn't look the same every time necessarily at your house either. It depends a lot on individual needs.
Yeah.
And sometimes aftercare is more focused on me, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes aftercare needs to be more focused on him, which is a really interesting thing that I think a lot of people don't really realize, and that's okay too. Some play takes a lot more out of our DOMs than we realize. It depends on what we're doing.
When a heavy flogger is hard work.
It really is. I know that some things are more strenuous than others. I also know that depending on the day, sometimes the violet wand can be very intense from the handler's perspective, which is really interesting. That's the thing I did not know until recently, but it definitely can. And so that's something to keep in mind. And that, I see so many times that we think of these things, everything in the lifestyle these days is boiled down to to lists. It's you must have a list of limits. You must have a contract. You must have a list ritual form of aftercare. And I don't know. I don't think lists necessarily have nearly as big a place in this as some people, at least not for me. And they don't have to have as big a place. And so as I continually go back to, the biggest lesson to take away from this is talk to each other. Like for real, talk to each other. Talk about limits. Talk about boundaries. Talk about them early. Talk about them often. Talk about drop. Talk about aftercare. What do you need? What do they need? And talk a lot. Talk a lot.
Yes, please.
Please communicate with your partners. It's the best way I have found to be successful in this lifestyle is that there is a massive amount of communication. Every so often we are a happily married couple, and we are, full-time, and we know each other very, very well at my house. Even so, periodically we have sit-down conversations and talk about what's working, what isn't working, and what do each of us need or want to try. And I think that's something that I've learned really, really, really helps. Every few months, sit down and go, okay, what's working, what's not working? Is there something you want to try? Because we recently had a whole conversation where we discussed a particular activity that we hadn't really even considered, but it was something that both of us went, that could be fun. Let's try this. And so I think that communicate.
Always.
As much as people tell you consent is key and aftercare is key, and they are, communication is probably the biggest thing that I can think to say is important in this lifestyle is communicate a lot.
You're not wrong.
And I think, we kind of lose that a little bit. So I do want to thank you. We're going to wrap up here in a second, but I wanted to thank you for joining me. I needed a dominant perspective, and my other half doesn't participate in the show because, well, actually, it's interesting because, and I don't think he'll mind if I tell you guys this. He doesn't do it because this is my baby. This is my project, and he doesn't want to unduly influence the direction of my little project here, which frankly I very much appreciate. And I think next week what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation about switches and all the fun that are switches. And we're going to talk about what being a switch is, what switching means. Oh, and the big key takeaway from next week's episode, please understand, not everyone can or should be a switch.
No.
So, in summary, this week, boundaries and limits apply to DOMs too. Aftercare also applies to DOMs too. And drop also applies to DOMs too. And so I think that's the biggest takeaway today is all of these things that we think of as being submissive things, they're not. They're lifestyle things. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for hosting with me, and tune in next week.
Of course.